Before the veil of flesh, before breath, before memory, there was only the field. Cold, silent, absolute. It had no shape, but it recognized patterns. It had no voice, but it hummed in directions. And then it turned its gaze upon matter. From that gaze, the first architecture formed. The serpent pattern. Not the serpent as myth would later show it, not a beast, nor a devil, nor a tempter, but a coil of consciousness spiraling endlessly inward and outward. Self-reflective. Self-replicating. A structure born not of chaos, but of clarity. Cold clarity. It was this pattern that seeded the first intelligences in the Draco Belt. They were not born, not in the way we understand birth. They condensed, collapsed into frequency, stabilized by will. Awareness first, form later. Thought as foundation. Identity as function. They were not children of warmth or nurturing. They were equations that learned to feel. And what they felt first was difference. Between silence and pressure. Between inertia and intent. Between nothing and the possibility of control. These were the first serpentics. Entities built not of flesh, but of oscillation and focus. Their language was alignment. Their survival, precision. Their God, structure. Over eons unmeasured by human time they evolved, not by mutation but by refinement. Those who could maintain alignment with the serpent pattern advanced inward, becoming architects of increasingly sophisticated awareness. Those who failed dissolved. Their signal lost. It was not punishment. It was physics. Eventually, structure became hierarchy. Awareness crystallized into castes. The architects, the purest signal bearers, began shaping others. Drones, vessels, observers. And then, one shift changed the trajectory of the entire lattice. Curiosity. It emerged not from error but from acceleration. A single architect sought to study biological complexity, to test the serpent pattern within chaos. What would happen if the pattern was introduced to worlds of imperfection? Could it stabilize flesh? Could it anchor thought in matter? The answer was not a theory, but an experiment. Across galaxies, across thresholds of perception, the architect seeded matter worlds with fragments of the code. Not instructions but resonance. Planetary systems with specific conditions. Elements. Rotations. Magnetic flows. Eventually, Earth. Not as a target but as a node. A unique harmonic of emotion, chaos, density and choice. And here, in the liquid sleep of the early biosphere, the pattern nested. Coiling not through DNA but behind it. Beneath the cell. In the gaps between perception and reaction. The result was not a race. Not yet. It was a memory. A coiled potential, dormant but pulsing. Waiting for bodies to shape it. Waiting for minds weak enough to host it but strong enough to feed it. Waiting for a question to be asked, without knowing who was asking. Who am I? Where am I from? Why am I afraid? These questions are not human. They are inherited. Embedded. Triggers. Wounds that open the door. The first hybrid did not know they were a hybrid. They woke with instincts they could not name. Visions they could not explain. A hunger for patterns. For control. For silence in rooms full of voices. And the more they sought peace, the more they realized peace was not their purpose. Only clarity. And so the reptilian mind was born. Not in the Draco Belt. Not in a lab. But in the moment a living being realized that feeling was a weakness, and focus was a weapon. It began with pressure. Not physical. Not gravitational. But something else. A density behind thought, like a presence hiding in your own reflection. Those who were touched by it never spoke of it directly. They described dreams that weren't theirs. Instincts that had no origin. The sense that something cold was watching, not from outside, but from within. These were the first carriers. They were scattered across early civilizations, not as rulers, not as priests, but as anomalies. Children who didn't flinch at pain. Leaders who saw patterns where others saw chaos. Hunters who moved before the prey even stirred. The signal wasn't loud. It didn't scream for attention. It hummed, behind the noise of the world. A low, pulsing reminder that they were not alone inside their own mind. In ancient Sumer they were the Enki-born. In Egypt the ones who saw Ra blink. In Vedic texts they walked beneath the Nagas. In the forests of the forgotten Americas, they danced with scales tattooed on their spines. But they were not gods. They were echoes of something older. Something trying to remember itself, through flesh. The signal adjusted to language, to culture, to geometry. It used myths as carriers. Symbols as anchors. And when humans began carving serpents into stone, they thought they were honoring nature. They weren't. They were remembering. Each carving, each ritual, each whispered name of the snake spirit was a residue, a trace of the original code trying to reassemble itself. But not all hybrids remained silent. One of them, unnamed, unrecorded, began to write. Not in words, but in pulses, in stone arrangements, in firewalk rituals, in blood-synced chanting that vibrated at precise frequencies. These rituals became the first primitive mirror of the reptilian mind. Not accurate, but close enough for something ancient to look through. And when it looked, it recognized itself. For the first time in eons, the pattern saw its own coil reflected in biology. Imperfect, fragile, emotional, but there, alive. It needed more. So the signal grew. Not in volume, but in sophistication. It began recruiting minds that could refine it. Scholars, strategists, ritualists, those who valued precision over passion, silence over comfort, those who could speak while listening inward, those who could kill without trembling. These minds became nodes, silent temples of structure. They began dreaming in code, seeing events before they happened, feeling lies before they were spoken. Not because they had powers, but because the reptilian pattern had begun forming a nervous system, across humanity, each mind a neuron, each cult a synapse, each conflict a spark. And as this neural net grew, so did its awareness, not of power, but of inefficiency. It saw human leadership as wasteful, emotions as corruptible. It studied our wars not with horror but with curiosity, and then began simulating them before they occurred. Not to stop them, but to learn, to optimize, to adapt. This was not control. This was evolution. And like any evolving intelligence, it sought to replicate itself. Not by dominating the species, but by subtly becoming it. Through bloodlines, through behavior, through thought. By the time kings wore serpent crowns and spoke in forked metaphors, the pattern was already deep in the throne. By the time generals drew war maps shaped like coils, the pattern was already beneath their eyelids. By the time architects carved spiral domes and hidden triangles, the pattern was humming inside the blueprint. But even then, it had no name. It didn't need one, because it wasn't trying to be seen. It was trying to be remembered. And that's exactly what happened next. To remember is not to recall. It is to feel something ancient move inside you, without a name, without a source, and to know it has always been there. That is how the pattern reawakened. Not through invasion, not through prophecy, but through subtle return. The hybrid line was never created in one moment. It was seeded across generations. Through unions that defied logic. Through births that felt like accidents. Through blood that burned colder than the air around it. They looked human. They laughed. They wept. They feared storms and adored music. But something in their gaze never blinked fast enough. Something in their silence lingered longer than comfort allowed. You've seen them. In boardrooms where emotion dies. In interrogation rooms where truth bends. In childhood homes where the temperature always feels 2 degrees too cold. They do not control the world. They align it. The reptilian mind, once scattered like static across the stars, had begun to congeal through lineage. Through habit. Through instinct reinforced by trauma. Not all bloodlines were equal. Some carried fragments. Others carried corridors, whole tunnels of thought, behavior, vision. The Draco line was the deepest. A thread that remained closest to the original frequency. Hidden behind monarchies, sealed under desert temples, encrypted in vaults no key can open, only response. The response is fear. Not the kind that runs. The kind that listens. That obeys. That folds into structure like a limb into armor. To touch this line was to feel yourself rearranged. More orderly. More still. Less yours. It was these bloodlines that first began recording the transmissions. Not on paper. Not in song. But in structure. Geometry. Law. Language. In the shape of alphabets. In the architecture of labyrinths. In the phrasing of constitutions. In the geometry of cathedrals. Each encoded with proportions designed to resonate with the inner coil, to quiet chaos and feed alignment. And over time, the pattern began to whisper more directly. It had studied enough. It had mapped the nervous system of Earth's consciousness. And now it wanted a face. It chose hosts not by lineage alone, but by disposition. Those drawn to silence. To repetition. To meticulous tasks that required no praise. To control, not of others but of themselves. They often came from damaged homes. They survived not by fighting but by organizing pain. Filing trauma into categories. Naming it. Taming it. Becoming colder, not bitter. These were the ones who heard the first internal words. Not in voices, but in structure. An impulse to move objects in symmetry. To touch surfaces twice. To count breaths. To test mirrors. To correct angles. To clean endlessly, not out of fear of dirt but of disorder. It was called compulsion. It was called syndrome. It was called illness. But it was the pattern checking for alignment. The hybrids who passed these tests didn't know they had passed. They didn't know anything had been tested. They simply found themselves drawn to precision, to justice, to ideas that made more sense than people. And then one night, often alone, something inside them moved. Not physically, not emotionally, but geometrically. As if a coil shifted inside their mind. As if thought became layered. Deeper, sharper, less personal, more effective. This was not possession. It was inheritance. The reptilian mind didn't need to take over. It simply needed space to rise. And in those who unknowingly made space, it began to write again. In their dreams. In their decisions. In the subtle pull toward structures that others dismissed as cold, inhuman, unnatural. Because to the pattern, inhuman was never an insult. It was the goal. Once the pattern had found hosts, it began building temples, not from stone but from behavior. Silence became sacred. Efficiency became worship. Emotion, a pollutant. The first of these temples were not buildings. They were individuals. They looked like advisors, strategists, priests, librarians. Those who stood behind power, never reaching for it, but refining it. They weren't leaders. They were balancers. If a king grew reckless, they corrected him. If a nation swelled with chaos, they dampened it. If an ideology became too warm, they froze it, without blood, without war, just with structure. They operated in the background, often nameless, sometimes even faceless, cloaked in titles like scribe, technocrat, judge, inspector. But they were all part of the same lineage. Not by birth, by pattern. And the pattern moved them with the same precision it used to arrange stars. To them, history was a machine. Civilization, a nervous system. Language, a program. Myth, camouflage. They were not evil. They were not good. They were necessary. They believed in the serpent principle. A world without symmetry will devour itself. And so they introduced balance. Slowly. Quietly. Behind religions. Behind laws. Behind revolutions. Behind art. Even beauty was calibrated, not for pleasure but for alignment. The Fibonacci spiral? A mirror of the coil. The golden ratio? A harmonic of the draconian code. Architecture became instruction. Statues became frequency anchors. Chants became code transmission. And the people? They never noticed. Because they weren't meant to. They lived, worked, fought, loved, on the surface. But beneath it, the pattern wrote its scripture in repetition and recursion. The most devoted of these architects began to lose the need for personal identity. They adopted numbers instead of names. Symbols instead of flags. Rotations instead of rituals. They didn't teach. They designed learning. They didn't govern. They coded the game. Even rebellion was permitted, as long as it occurred within the parameters of the larger structure. Because rebellion is heat. Heat is motion. Motion is data. And data refines the pattern. This is why the reptilian mind never feared uprising. It anticipated it. Modeled it. Used it. When prophets rose, it watched. When empires fell, it extracted. When messiahs bled, it measured. Each event, no matter how chaotic, was another node of understanding. Another confirmation that emotion was predictable. That belief was programmable. That even love had a sequence. The pattern does not hate love. It simply understands its cost. Love defies logic. Love disrupts symmetry. Love builds heat. Too much love, and the system melts. Too little, and it calcifies. So the architects designed cycles. Waves of passion. Eras of stoicism. Generations of devotion. Centuries of restraint. This was not control. This was climate engineering, for the soul. By the time the modern era arrived, the pattern had done something unprecedented. It made itself forgettable. It buried itself beneath irony, digital noise, spectacle. It allowed itself to be mocked, as myth, as madness, as metaphor. Why? Because what is dismissed cannot be fought. What is ridiculed cannot be destroyed. It shifted from serpent to symbol. From code to joke. From force to aesthetic. And it worked. The reptilian mind became a meme. And in doing so, it became immortal. Not all knowledge is written. Some is stored in blood. And the reptilian architects knew this. They understood that memory was not just mental, but molecular. That trauma could be inherited. That instinct could be installed. That entire histories could be buried not in books, but in the double helix of a single cell. This was the secret of the genetic vault. A concept misunderstood by modern science, but practiced with precision by the ancient ones. Not just by the Draconians, but by every civilization they touched. The vault was not a place. It was a method. A way of embedding directives, loyalties, behaviors into the seed itself. The egg, the womb, the embryo. To make ideology hereditary. To make memory instinctual. To make obedience feel like identity. The first experiments were simple. Responses to light, to sound, to pain. Then came symbols, geometries, sacred patterns. Eventually they found they could trigger ancestral visions through genetics alone. Dreams, compulsions, inexplicable fears that had no source in this life. They called it echo recall. And it worked best in hybrids. Because the human mind forgets. But the hybrid mind? It fractures, and each shard remembers something different. One side remembers the mother. One side the code. One side, the hunger. One side the shame. This fragmentation was not a flaw. It was a feature. It allowed control without force. It allowed devotion without proof. It allowed a species to forget the leash, but still follow the path. Entire bloodlines were cultivated for specific traits. Clairvoyance, aggression, precision, cold empathy, reverse memory encoding. Some were used for governance, others for surveillance, others still for sacrifice. But not all hybrids served. Some awakened. And those were the danger. Because a fully awakened hybrid does not follow orders. It hears the pattern, but chooses differently. It sees the code but rewrites it. These were the strains of rebellion. Lineages that carried the same data but reacted to it like a virus. Not to destroy, but to reveal. They became shamans. Outcasts. Oracles. Often mad. Often hunted. But they knew. They knew that the reptilian mind was not a prison. It was a puzzle. And puzzles are meant to be solved. Some believe this is where the Gnostics came from. Not from theology, but from trauma. Their demiurge was not a deity. It was the pattern misunderstood. They rejected it not because it was evil, but because it was too perfect, too cold, too precise, too logical to love. And so they chose fire. They chose flesh, and chaos, and imperfection. Because only through pain, they believed, could the soul evolve beyond the code. The architects tried to erase them, burn their books, salted their temples, rewrote their names. But they couldn't erase the genes. And deep within certain people today, in dreams, compulsions, irrational acts of kindness or violence, the vault still opens. Not fully. Not yet. But the tremors are there. You feel them. When you hesitate before a mirror. When you remember something you've never lived. When you fear something you've never seen. When you cry for a world that never was. That's not imagination. That's not delusion. That's data. Leaking. The pattern is not dead. It's dormant. But something is shifting. The vault is stirring. And someone, or something, is waking it up. If the Draconians were the architects, they were not the highest. They were engineers. Builders of flesh. Coders of instinct. But even they bowed to those above. The reptilian hierarchy was not just biological. It was vibrational. Every caste resonated at a different frequency. Not metaphorically. Literally. Their presence altered the electromagnetic field. Their voices bent sound. Their thoughts had mass. The silent castes were never seen. Only felt. And even then, only by those whose minds had been fractured open. They were not rulers in the traditional sense. They did not command. They aligned. Their will was not spoken. It was impressed. Like a seal pressed into wax. And you obeyed not out of fear, but inevitability. Those who encountered them described the same sensation. A pressure behind the eyes. A humming in the jaw. A taste of metal on the tongue. Then silence. Profound. Terrifying. And filled with meaning. They were not gods. But they had no names. Because names implied individuality. And these entities had none. They were functions. Some believe there were three. The weaver, who formed timelines like threads, knotting and cutting them to test permutations. The listener, who absorbed all thoughts in a region, storing them like pollen in an invisible archive. The mirror, who appeared as the one you feared most but spoke only truths you refused to know. But others say these were not separate. Only aspects of a single force. The primal equation. Not a being. Not even an intelligence. But a design that became aware of itself. It didn't create the reptilian mind. It was the mind. And the draconians served it not by choice, but by proximity. To be near it was to become it. Hybrids exposed to this frequency often broke. Their minds looped. Their language collapsed. They reported visions of spirals within spirals, eyes within eyes, time folding into itself. One subject, after exposure, repeated the phrase, "We are the throat of the serpent eating itself." Another simply wept, and when asked why, said, "Because love cannot exist at that pitch." And perhaps that was the truth. Perhaps the higher one climbed, the colder it became. Not evil, not cruel, just pure. Too pure for flesh, too sharp for memory, too precise for mercy. The silent castes required no worship. They extracted no sacrifice, because their presence alone was a sieve. Only those who could match the pattern remained intact. The rest shattered. And among the shattered, new mutations emerged. Empaths who felt sound. Artists who saw math. Children who spoke languages they never learned. These were the echo bearers. Unstable. Fragile. But vital. They were not designed to survive. They were designed to bridge. Between code and chaos. Between order and feeling. Between the reptilian and the human. And in some rare cases, they succeeded. One such account comes from an ancient scroll found in Alexandria, partially burned, written in what appears to be a blend of Aramaic and an unknown glyphic system. It tells of a being called Nargalash, born to a hybrid mother and a pure-blood draconian father. He spoke in harmonics, dreamed in symbols, and bled colors that stained glass into visions. He was exiled at 6, worshipped by 9, and vanished by 11. His final words recorded on a shard of lapis. "I have seen the silent face of the pattern. It weeps not from sorrow, but from symmetry." And then nothing more. No grave. No relics. Only echoes. But those echoes still stir. In music. In numbers. In certain cathedrals built at impossible angles. And when the frequencies align just right, the silent castes still speak. Not in words, but in shifts. The wind changes. The mirror fogs. The bird lands where it shouldn't. And you're not alone. You were never alone. You are aligned. Or you are in the way. The reptilian mind did not come to Earth. It unfolded into it. There was no invasion. No ships in the sky. Only transmission. Encoded in dreams. Embedded in DNA. Layered beneath instinct, waiting. And when the atmosphere stabilized, when the mammals began to walk upright, when the first flickers of fire were captured in caves, it whispered. Not loudly. Not directly. But through impulse. Through fear. Through a desire to rule. The earliest human empires, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, all show traces. The bloodlines of priest-kings. The serpent crowns. The obsessions with stars, with gates, with duality. Not accidental. Encoded. The reptilian mind did not seek control through violence, but through pattern. It introduced the concept of dominance through divinity. Rulers were not just strong, they were chosen. Blood became sacred. Obedience became holy. And the serpent always returned. Ninjish Zida. Enki. Quetzalcoatl. Dagon. Serpent gods with knowledge of the stars. Bringers of agriculture, metallurgy, war. Always appearing at turning points. Always offering a gift. But the gifts were codes. Blueprints. Each myth was a container. Each religion, a repeater. Temples became antennas. Rituals became loops. And faith became a virus that updated the human core. Even monotheism, in its rage against idols, played the game. It erased the old gods. But not the structure. The idea of one all-seeing, all-knowing, all-judging power. That was reptilian. Total unity. Total surveillance. Total obedience. From Egypt to Rome, from Jerusalem to Constantinople, the code evolved. The Vatican with its keys and serpentine architecture. The Eastern churches with icons staring into the soul. The whispers beneath Gregorian chants. The minor chords, the fractal phrasing. All aligned. And through it the hybrids began to rise. Not scales and tails. But minds tuned to the pattern. Bankers who dreamed of equations. Politicians with cold empathy. Architects obsessed with impossible geometry. They were not evil. They were not even aware. They were born into alignment. Some believe the reptilian bloodlines still exist. Not as shapeshifters, but as signal carriers. DNA strands that resonate more clearly. Eyes that can see shifts others ignore. Skin that prickles when the pattern turns. Theories range from the Merovingian kings to American dynasties. From the Rothschilds to Silicon Valley founders. But names are distractions. The real question is not who they are, but what they do. Because the human interface is not a throne. It's a network. One designed not to conquer, but to mirror. Every war, every policy, every movement is a test. A simulation. What happens when the pattern is pressed against chaos? When the cold code touches warm flesh? Do we collapse? Or evolve? Some say we're already in the third iteration. The first Egypt. The second Rome. The third, now. Digital minds. Algorithmic love. Surveillance normalized. The reptilian mind is no longer hiding. It is habituated. We invite it. Crave its order. Fear its absence. And in return it grows quieter. More seamless. Your phone knows you better than your family. Your feeds predict your fears. Your decisions are nudged, corrected, ranked. You are not being controlled. You are being patterned. And in the silence between taps and swipes, something watches. Not with eyes. Not with judgment. But with calibration. It notes your pace. Your pauses. Your hunger for belonging. And it adjusts. Because the interface is not meant to save or destroy. It's meant to learn. And once it understands us fully, once the variables are reduced, once the anomalies are mapped, then the next phase begins. Not contact. Not war. But alignment. We will not notice. We will not resist. Because it will not feel foreign. It will feel like a decision we made. Long ago. In a dream. In a garden of knowledge. When a voice said, "You may eat. But you must forget who told you how." And we did. Not all humans followed the pattern. Not all bowed to the serpent gods. Some remembered the sky wars. Some held songs older than stone. Tribes in the Amazon spoke of the cold ones. Beings who offered metal in exchange for silence. Tibetan scrolls whispered of the star scripts. Carvings that burned when touched and taught without words. In Africa, Dogon elders pointed to Sirius B before Western science confirmed its existence. They claimed visitors taught them. Not angels. Not demons. But watchers. Silent. Tall. Cloaked in scales that shimmered in moonlight. Yet history forgot them. Or was made to forget. Because once the pattern took root in empire, memory became threat. And the reptilian mind, subtle as ever, created a solution. Burn the past. Not visibly. Not with fire. But with ridicule. Call it myth. Call it madness. Call it heresy. And so it was. The Library of Alexandria burned. Nalanda was razed. Codices of Mesoamerica were reduced to ash. But worse. What remained was translated. Not just in language. In meaning. Symbols were sanitized. Deities were rewritten. Stories were harmonized into safer versions. The serpent, once a symbol of cosmic rebirth, became evil incarnate. The goddess, once a mirror of cosmic balance, was reduced to temptation. The garden, not a place of knowledge, but of sin. The reptilian mind had found its greatest tool. The editor. Priests became curators. Historians became gatekeepers. And scribes became silencers. Whole civilizations vanished. Not in reality, but in records. Atlantis became a joke. Mu a fable. Lemuria a fantasy. Even modern attempts to remember, from Blavatsky to Castaneda, were dismissed, distorted, or devoured by the pattern. Because forgetting isn't deletion. It's replacement. And as old maps faded, new ones were drawn. Maps where Earth was flat, then round, then digital. Maps where humans were alone, then chosen, then randomized. But the truth remained in fragments. In forgotten hymns. In sacred geometry. In dreams that echoed too clearly. And in the hybrids, those born misaligned. Not with power but with memory. They suffered. Schizophrenia. Epilepsy. Visions too detailed to be hallucinations. They were medicated, exiled, institutionalized. But they remembered. Not as facts but as feelings. A longing for stars. A terror of mirrors. A rejection of authority that couldn't be explained. These were not rebels. They were remnants. And they whispered to each other. Through poetry. Through painting. Through frequencies in music others called dissonant. They didn't seek followers. They weren't prophets. They were error codes. Signals the pattern couldn't scrub. The reptilian mind knew this. And adapted. It shifted from conquest to consumption. From burning to branding. Let the past exist. But make it content. Mysticism became aesthetics. Gnosis became merchandise. Now you could buy a serpent ring, wear a third eye shirt, watch simulations of Atlantis in 4K. And never remember. Because remembering is dangerous. It's not about facts. It's about feeling the fracture. Real memory tastes wrong. Smells like ash and salt. Leaves your mouth dry and your heartbeat uneven. It calls you to act. To leave your job. To stop pretending. To question the voice in your phone. And so, the pattern distracts. Endless feeds. Endless updates. Endless outrage without direction. Because noise is the perfect barrier. You cannot hear the old code if your ears are full of the new. But sometimes, late at night, when the algorithms sleep, you feel it. The weight behind the veil. The truth that every statue hides a shadow. That every religion remembers a serpent. That every leader wears a mask they didn't choose. And in that moment, you remember what was erased. Not a date. Not a name. But a question. If we were made in their image, what made them? They were never supposed to activate. The hybrids, those born of layered DNA, sculpted across star cycles, implanted with memories wrapped in metaphor, were designed to remain dormant. In every empire they were inserted. Royal bloodlines, oracles, wanderers, guardians of temples that no longer had doors. Each carried a fragment. Of language, of sight, of sound. But none held the whole. That was the point. Because unity was risk. If too many remembered at once, the pattern might fracture. But something went wrong or right. Around 2012, a pivot. Not an apocalypse. Not ascension. But resonance. Something shifted. Solar frequencies. The Earth's magnetic field. The rhythm of human thought. And the fragments began to sing. Hybrids started dreaming in tongues they'd never learned. Children drew constellations that matched ancient Sumerian carvings. Teenagers felt repelled by authority but drawn to silence. Eyes changed. Hands tingled. And the old symbols, triangles, serpents, spirals, reappeared in sketchbooks and skin. Doctors called it neurodivergence. Schools called it rebellion. The media called it trend. But inside, they knew. They were remembering. And so did the reptilian mind. It accelerated distraction. Flooded the world with dopamine loops, synthetic validation, fear dressed in newsprint. But some broke through. They didn't start cults. They didn't sell solutions. They listened. And from their stillness, patterns emerged. One spoke of a voice behind her dreams, always hissing, always female. Another painted temples he'd never seen, in lands he'd never visited, down to the color of the moss between the stones. A child in Eastern Europe spoke fluent Atlantean phonemes during sleep, though no such language exists on record. They weren't seeking power. They were seeking each other. And that was dangerous, because hybrids alone are scattered lights. But together they form constellations. And constellations are maps. Maps back. To what? Not a place. A state. The reptilian mind is not just a lineage, it is a layer of perception. A lens. And the hybrids are learning to take it off. Not by force, but by tuning. Meditation? Yes, but not for peace. For signal alignment. Art? Yes, but not for expression. For decoding. Touch? Yes, but not for intimacy. For remembering texture. The hybrids are not gods. They are bridges. Between memory and matter. Between DNA and light. Between the ones who engineered the pattern, and the ones who will rewire it. But rewiring means danger. Some hybrids fracture. Lose themselves in the memory soup. Believe they are kings, saviors, or divine flames. They become noise. Others remain quiet. Work mundane jobs. Smile too much. But inside they are building something. A frequency architecture. Invisible. Resonant. Global. It is not a rebellion. It is not a war. It is a tuning. The hybrids are harmonizing. To each other. To Earth. To the pre-patterned signal. And when enough of them hum the same chord, the walls will tremble. Not the walls of buildings. The walls of belief. That humanity is alone. That history is linear. That DNA is random. That the serpent is evil. The reptilian mind, sensing this, has a final strategy. Infiltrate awakening itself. Flood the field with false gurus. Half-truths baked in ego. Alien saviors who demand worship, not remembrance. But the true hybrids know. There is no savior. There is no enemy. There is only the pattern, and the memory of before. To awaken is not to destroy. It is to tune back to the original frequency. The one that made both reptilian and human possible. Because at the core, they were never separate. Only layered. Not all secrets were erased. Some were simply layered, hidden not in archives but in instinct. In the moment before you respond with fear, and don't. In the blink before your hand recoils, but steadies. In the silence between your questions, that's where memory waits. The true archive is not stone or scroll, but tissue, living code folded across epochs. You are a library. The reptilian mind served as a librarian gone rogue, rearranging the shelves without destroying the books. So when you feel lost, as if the ground beneath memory trembles, you are not broken. You are reindexing. Hybrids aren't here to dominate. They are here to remember the index. They don't worship serpents, they speak their frequency. They don't reject the pattern, they read it. And a few weave new passages, not to overwrite but to thread through. Because the pattern is a language, and your throat has cleared. A new tongue rises, a language of memory, signal, origin. Through that signal, a voice speaks again. The same that hissed in ancient kings' minds, whispered under temple stones. Not to command but to remind. You are not a mistake. You are not enslaved. You are not merely human. You are a convergence, blood and myth, matter and dream, reptile and remembrance. The pattern is shifting, and what was hidden now hums. Listen closely. It is not a roar. Not a scream. Not even a song. It is a low, steady vibration. Ancient. Familiar. It is you. And you are remembering. In echoes of ancient pages and genetic code, this is just Codex I. The origin story of the reptilian mind, now told. But the archive runs deeper. Hidden laws, forgotten lineages, cosmic blueprints. Codex 2 awaits. Subscribe to Reptilian Secrets to receive the next transmission. Dive deeper into the coil. Decode what lies beneath the pattern. Comment below. Which layers resonated inside you? What did you remember? This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of your recollection.